This is Jack Rice for Air America Radio, and I'm here with Anita Sharma. She's the North American coordinator for the United Nations Millennium campaign. Anita, thanks for joining me.
Hi, Jack. Great to be here.
Now, tell me about these goals. They go back to 2000,
They do.
and there was an idea that you were going to address this sort of very big picture, and I remember talking to a lot of people about this over the years. Let's look at the sort of big picture Millennium goals.
Sure. The goals themselves were an effort at the United Nations to really take this idea that we can be the first generation to end extreme poverty by 2015, and it puts the poverty reduction at the center of development strategy. And what's so interesting and compelling and even awesome about the goals is that it's a partnership between rich and poor countries. So here at the United Nations, there was this effort to come up with concrete targets and indicators and really be a compass, a moral compass for human rights and social justice issues. And the goals themselves, they're 8 goals, and they work to end extreme poverty and hunger, to empower women, to ensure that all children have access to education, to improve children's health, to reduce maternal mortality, and to combat diseases like HIV/AIDS and malaria, and to improve the environment and to ensure that people have access to clean water and sanitation. And the 8th goal is this partnership that I was talking about, in which all countries, including the United States, said that they will work together to help achieve these goals.
When I listen to the goals, they sound great. But to me, in many ways, it's like loving babies and puppies. You know what I mean? I mean, it's easy to be able to say that. The real question is that next step. That's the hard next step, is to say, how do you actually do this? How do you institute goals like this with rich and poor countries simply coming together to do that?
Right, and people have said the same to me. It's like world peace. I mean, who can be against that? Who can be against a world that all people have basic human rights and dignity? And that's really what we're talking about. So the goals themselves, though, allowed countries to have a framework to work to achieve them. And the best thing about the goals is because all countries agreed, and they agreed at the United Nations, they are now accountable. They are accountable to their citizens. So in the United States, we can say, what have you as a government been doing to ensure that development is front and center in U.S. foreign assistance strategy?
Yeah, but that's also very difficult when you realize there are some countries, the governments themselves have limited control. I can take you to the Democratic Republic of the Congo. I can take you to Sudan, where I was this last year, and elsewhere. And there are those limited capabilities, let alone whether they want to do it or not. So how do you help those countries at least establish not just a framework, but actually institute sufficient control to do that? And that sounds sort of outside of your bailiwick, isn't it?
Not really, in the sense that the goals themselves also talk about the need for good governance. And so you really can't have development if you don't have a stable society, or if you have a despotic regime which doesn't really care about the well-being of its people. So you can't do development, you can't achieve the Millennium Development Goals if there's conflict. But what you can do is work to create this system and build capacity in those countries to do what you can, so that, for example, one of the goals which has not had it's had the least amount of success is goal number 5, focusing on maternal mortality. And I'll just kind of segue for a little bit in the sense that every minute of every day, a woman dies in childbirth, and she dies through causes related to her pregnancy. And this is not a disease, but it is a slow-rolling genocide. And this can be halted and reversed by very simple practices. If a health clinic has access to medication, if there's electricity in the village, so if a woman is having complications, she can have surgery. And so that's just kind of one indication of a goal which does not take huge amounts of money or resources, but kind of small practices that can be put in place. And by our help in terms of building capacity, in expertise, we can make a huge difference.
But if there are multiple demands and they come from 15 different directions, and everybody will say, I have this and this is important, and everybody will agree that's important too, how do you say, no, listen to me? I mean, how do you basically move up the chain of demand and say, we're trying to do something that's incredibly important here and something we could do with limited amounts of resources, so give us some of those limited amounts of resources? Isn't that your problem?
It's not. Yes, it's a question of resources, but it's also a question of accountability and capacity. And so the goals provide that framework so countries can incorporate it. And going back to what you were saying in terms of every country having different demands, that was one of the problems with development assistance. So if you're the United States and you're really keen on improving children's health, and you're Canada and you really care about doing something else, and then you're going to those countries and you're saying do our pet project, it's going to be really difficult for that country to implement it. And so what the goals try to do, and like the goals themselves aren't this kind of amorphous thing, it's all of the countries working together, is provide a standard so that everybody can come together, coordinate, and so you're not duplicating efforts and you're making the most of your resources.
Are you optimistic that after, well, I guess 9 years now, and we're talking 2015, that is not that far away? I mean, it feels very pie in the sky. Have you been working your way towards it slowly but surely, or have things continued to sort of wax and wane?
If you had asked me last year, I probably would have been a lot more optimistic because of the just tremendous achievements that were made because of economic growth. So a country like Vietnam, for example, went from something like 58% of its population in extreme poverty to now less than 14%. China and India, because of this miraculous, economic growth that they had been experiencing, they were able to put resources to help with the goals. And now, so there were great achievements all over the globe in terms of reducing poverty and ending hunger. This past year, we've really been hit with a myriad of challenges. So we have climate change, which is affecting the poorest and most vulnerable. The financial crisis, which was caused started here in the U.S. and the reverberations are felt throughout the world, is really threatening to halt the achievement of the goals.
Before you go further, by the way, you realize how odd that is for Americans to think that something that happened on Wall Street here in New York City, well, at least outside of this building anyway, in New York on Wall Street, would actually have an impact in a village in Africa or working in Indonesia or working in parts of Central America. Right. But that is one of the ramifications too, isn't it?
Definitely. I mean, if you think about some of the examples that you just mentioned, our demand for something like clothing or an automobile, for example, in many cases it's manufactured in those countries. And so when the demand decreases, those factory workers are out of a job. People who have moved here to the United States to work and make a living send a huge portion of their income back in terms of remittances to help those poorer countries as well. In the United States, when there's not as many resources to go around, people and companies are not investing directly in the poorer countries. And so there's just been this incredible tightening in terms of the available financing. And it's really felt in those poorer countries because they don't have the social safety nets that we are so fortunate in this country to have. And so it's kind of like when the United States gets something that gets a cold, the whole world sneezes. It's one of those things. But I think we're starting to realize that we are interconnected. And in the United States, I mean, it's in our moral interests, and we care deeply about people and around the world and any kind of suffering and injustice. It's also in our economic interest to have a world that is more stable. And one of the things we didn't discuss is that it's in our security interests. And so security and health interests. So an issue like the swine flu, for example, we know that the diseases know no bounds. And in cases like Mexico, which doesn't have a strong health facility to address the problem, sooner or later that's going to come to the United States as well. So what we're saying is that if we can create a world that is more stable, then the whole world is a better place for it.
Anita, thank you so much for joining me.
Thank you very much. And if you want to learn more, I'd say go to our website, which is endpoverty2015.org.
Thank you.
Thank you.